Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is called Boeing's First 767 Glider, Air Canada Flight 143 on July 23, 1983. This is often referred to as the Gimli glider because that is the Royal Canadian Air Force base where the 767 ended up landing. Now, I was captain for 25 years, and on every aircraft I flew captain on, the 737, the 27, the Airbus 320, 319, the 777, I've had fuel quantity indicator issues. And there's few things that make me more nervous than having an issue with measuring the fuel quantity on board. And this is an accident that, it was a result of miscalculations due to multiple conversion factors that had to be made, and it gets really complicated. So hang on. Now, this was a scheduled passenger flight between Montreal and Edmonton. And what happened is they ran out of fuel on Saturday, July 23rd, 1983, at an altitude of 41,000 feet halfway through the flight. And they ended up landing at the Royal Canadian Air Force Base in Gimli, Manitoba, which the co-pilot was familiar with because he flew out of there when he was in the Royal Canadian Air Force, but he hadn't realized, and neither had the controllers when they were directed to this airfield or requesting this airfield, that it had been converted to a racetrack, which added just a little bit of issue to the whole thing. Now, the airplane had only been in service for about 2 years. The 767s were very new, and they had a lot of issues initially with the fuel quantity indicator system. There were 2 channels, and they were supposed to compare with each other, and if you had a problem, you could disable a channel, but if you disabled the channel, then you had to have the other method of calculating the fuel, which was using drip sticks, as we call them in the U.S. What you basically do, and this was an old system where you essentially, there are multiple ports in the wing tanks of the airliners, the fuel tanks, and you essentially take a hollow tube and you push it up through there until it stops dripping. So that indicates how high the tube went into the tank, and it would be indexed on the tube, and you'd read out the number, and then you'd go to a complicated chart, and you'd read, okay, at this drip stick location, because there would be many locations across the tank, depending on the size of the airplane, at this location, this indication means you have this much fuel. And of course, the other ones would have to track with that, giving you a similar type of reading. Now, they were having a lot of trouble with the master minimum equipment list, and the airplane had only been out 2 years. It went through like 55 revisions. There were some parts of it that were just even blank because they hadn't kept up to speed, and they weren't supposed to fly this airplane without any fuel quantity indicators. They were supposed to enable one of the backup channels, and if you had a failure of one channel and it screwed up the other channel, you'd get a blank indication, you'd disable the channel, and everything would be fine. Okay, you follow in here? This gets complicated. This is quite an incident to talk about, and like I said, I had several people want me to talk about. Basically, they took off on their flight between their initial departure and the arrival airfield with only 45% of the fuel they should have had on board. Now, the aircraft had been flown in to Montreal, and the previous captain had made the correct conversion of centimeters to liters to kilograms, and found it agreed with the fuel quantity indication system, which was operational. But they had a technician come on who was going to try to troubleshoot it, and he got interrupted in the process and left the one of the circuit breakers in for the fuel system in there, which brought the defective system on board, which blanked out the indicator. Well, the captain who was picking it up, Bob Pearson, and the first officer, Quintal, thought that the aircraft had flown in that condition with no fuel indicator indications at all, which was not correct and was not the way it was supposed to be operated. They thought it arrived that way, it had been flown that way, so everything was fine, even though the master MEL says, no, you don't fly it that way. There was a lot of confusion at the time, and maintenance was actually able to sign off the aircraft in what you might consider violation of the MMEL, just because everything was in a lot of turmoil. But fueling error did occur, and like I said, they didn't have enough fuel, and I'll talk about the exact nature of that fueling error and how it occurred in just a second. But I want to talk about the flight first, because they were cruising over Red Lake, Ontario at 41,000 feet, a little bit after 8 p.m., and they got a low pressure warning indication on the left side. Well, they thought they had a boost pump failure. Okay, well, that happens. That's not too big of a deal. But shortly after that, the left engine quit. You know, they weren't immediately concerned because you can gravity feed the engines. They're made that way and they're flight tested that way. So it's not a big deal. So they thought, okay, we've lost an engine. We got a problem with the left engine. And they said, well, let's divert to Winnipeg. And shortly after that, though, they're getting set up for single engine landing in Winnipeg. But shortly after that, the right engine, they got a right side low pressure indication. The right engine quit. And they got a sound in the cockpit, which they said they had never heard before. It was an all engines out sound. It was a large bong. And they went to their checklist to find a procedure for flying with all engines out. But it had never been covered in training, and there was no checklist because it never occurred to anybody that they would lose all their engines. And the other thing about this was one of the first aircraft with a complete electronic flight instrumentation system. So when they lost both engines, they lost power, they lost electric power, and all the screens went blank. All they had was the battery power standby indicators. And one of the things they did not have on the standby indicator, which would have been very useful, would have been an indication of VVI, vertical velocity indication. So they were going down. They didn't know what their rate of descent was, but the captain was an experienced glider pilot, and he goes, okay, I'll assume 220 knots is a good best glide speed. They didn't have one apparently listed, so they said, okay, we'll do that. And the co-pilot says, hey, we're near this Gimli airfield, and he'd flown out of it, thought it was still an active airfield, or at least, it was at least an airfield they could land on. It had been closed down, but they started to head towards it, and of course they're talking to air traffic control. Now they lost their transponder. That's one of the higher level AC power type instruments. They lost that, so they had to do some rough calculations, and they lost the transponder return, so they didn't have altitude. They just had skin paint from air traffic control, so they had to do a little bit of estimates of their glide ratio with the help of air traffic control, and they lost 5,000 feet and 10 nautical miles, so they calculated they had a glide ratio of roughly 12 to 1. Now, of course, Captain had been a glider pilot, and he's used to 50 to 1 up to 71, so, airliners glide, but they don't glide all that great. But anyway, okay, they're coming down. They figure they can make a Gimli airfield. Okay, doesn't look too bad. But in the course of the whole thing, and they're flying on rat power because the airplane is, of course, a full hydraulic airplane. So you need something to power it. And with the engines down, just windmilling, you don't have sufficient hydraulic power. So they're flying on the ram air turbine. Okay, that's fine. I've flown in flight tests the 777-300 just powered by the ram air turbine, the rat. And I did some just to see how powerful the rat was. I did some aggressive maneuvering, kind of what these guys ended up doing. I did some aggressive maneuvering just to see how well the rat could supply pressure, and it was getting stalled out. It had a lot of trouble keeping up with heavy demands, and they were coming in to land on this airfield, and they saw they were high. So they're thinking, okay, we're going to do a 360, or what are we going to do? Because you know you only got so much runway to land on. And if you're coming in steep, you got a problem. So the captain did something that you typically don't do in an airliner, and that is he did a forward slip. Of course, that requires a lot of control inputs, and it was giving the rat not the best airflow. So the rat was having a little trouble powering those positions, and they noticed it when they came out that the aircraft was sluggish to come out. Now, it's kind of funny. Test pilots are different creatures than airline pilots, and I was talking to John Cashman on the 777, and I forgot what we got. John misinterpreted the question I was asking. He talked about, yeah, you can slip the 777 very nicely. It'll do a good slip, because they have to do a test. I digress here. They have to do a test where you do a slip and you're disrupting the airflow to the engine. You have to do that to determine that the engines will still operate. They won't compressor stall and stuff like that. So he's going, yeah, you could slip it on final if you want to. I go, well, John, slipping and airliners with passengers is not something that you do. You know, the drinks would be sloshing out over the glass, and they just don't appreciate that. So that was kind of a little funny situation. But they come in, okay, they don't have the hydraulics utility or center hydraulics typically, and I didn't fly the 67, so I'm not quite sure their configuration, but that's usually a hydraulic system that is not powered by the rat, because the rat only has so much power to give. So you use the common system of gravity drop. So you gravity drop the gear. Some airliners, like the 27, you actually can crank it down, but they gravity dropped it, and they didn't get the nose gear down, which was a good thing. I skidded one aircraft in flight test to a stop, a Cessna 404. I talk about that in the Cessna flight test little series of episodes I talk about, and that was beneficial in stopping, because sliding it to a stop on the nose did allow you extra braking capability, if you want to put it that way. The captain got on the brakes, and of course, without electrical power, you don't have anti-skid. And normally, if you want to stop a transport aircraft quickly, if you're not using the rejected takeoff, the RTO on the auto brakes, you get on the brakes heavily, and the anti-skid takes care of you. Well, no electrics, no anti-skid. He blew all the tires, and of course, the airplane slides to a stop on its nose. But that was good, because as they're coming in on final, of course, the airplane's quiet. Nobody hears it coming, and there are people down on the racetrack. They were having an event, and the people quickly, of course, got out of the way, because at the last minute they saw this airplane coming, and unfortunately, none of the passengers were seriously injured. Nobody on the ground was injured. Some of the people went off the rear slides. The tail's up in the air, as you can see, and the slides aren't meant to operate in that situation. And they had more altitude than slide, and that didn't work out the best. Now, on the flight from Montreal to Edmonton with the stop in Ottawa, the captain decided, well, I'm going to take enough fuel so I don't have to refuel in Ottawa. Now, that makes a lot of sense. You know, just make one more complicated procedure there that you can avoid. So, okay, that's fine. But they had a little issue with that, and they were criticized by the board because one thing Air Canada was criticized, one thing that had not happened when they converted basically from 3-person crews to 2-person crews, is the flight engineer was the one, and I did this on the 27, they were the ones responsible for doing the fuel calculations and keeping a fuel log and stuff like that. Well, when they went to the 2-person crew, nobody elected to assign the fuel duty to anybody on the crew. So, of course, it ultimately it drops to the captain as being the final responsibility. But on the day of the accident, they had the 2 technicians and the 2 pilots were working on the calculation. One technician was having trouble, so he just kind of gave up and stopped. The other technician was using a piece of paper, and he ran out of space on the piece of paper and had to stop his calculations. So First Officer Quintal did the calculations by hand, and the Captain Pearson cross-checked it with his Jepson slide rule. Now, since the system wasn't operating, like I said, they decided to take off on enough fuel to go all the way to their destination, Edmonton, without refueling. And the flight plan showed 22,300 kilograms or 49,200 pounds of fuel were required for the flight from Montreal to Ottawa to Edmonton. A dripstick check, they call it dripstick, we call it dipsticks, but dripsticks. The check found that they had 7,682 liters or 1,690 imperial gallons, 2,029 U.S. gallons of fuel on board, and so they calculated how much fuel the airplane had to take on. They needed to convert 7,682 liters of fuel already in the tanks to the equivalent mass in kilograms, subtracting that figure from the 22,300 kilograms of total fuel that would be needed, and convert that result back into its equivalent volume. The density of the metric units was 0.803 kilograms per liter, so the correct calculation would have been, okay, you with me here? You see why this is not the easiest thing to do in the world? The correct calculation would be 7,682 liters times 0.803 kilograms per liters, which gives you 6,169 kilograms, and that's the mass what they had on board. Then you take 22,300 kilograms minus 6,169 kilograms, and it gives you 16,131 kilograms. That's how much additional fuel they needed. And then you take 16,131 kilograms and you divide it by the density, 0.803 kilograms per liter, to give you 20,088 liters of volume of fuel required. Okay, now, at the time of this incident, Air Canada was converting from imperial to metric units. And as part of the process, the new 7067s acquired by Canada were the first to be calibrated for metric units. Okay, they had a mixture of these aircraft in the fleet, which added to the problem. The fueler reported that the density of the jet fuel was 1.77, which was pounds per liter. And since other Air Canada aircraft use pounds, Pearson and Quinto both use the density of jet fuel in pounds per liter without converting it to kilograms per liter. So they took 7.682 liters times 1.77 pounds per liter to get 13,597 pounds, which they misinterpreted as kilograms of fuel already on board. Then they took 22,300 kilograms minus 13,597 kilograms, and that equals 8,703 kilograms, the incorrect mass of additional fuel required. So now you're down to 8,703 kilograms divided by 1.77 pounds per liter to give you 4,917 pounds per liters per kilogram per pound. And that was misinterpreted as the additional fuel required. Okay, if you followed with me this so far, you're a better pilot than I am. So instead of taking on 20,088 liters of additional fuel, they took on only 4,917 liters because they used the incorrect conversion factor, and that's what led to the whole problem in not having enough fuel on board. Well, following Air Canada's investigation, the captain was demoted for 6 months, the first officer was suspended for 2 weeks, and 3 maintenance officers were also suspended. However, in 1985, this accident occurred in 83. In 1985, both Pearson and Quinto were awarded the first ever Federation and Aeronautic International Diploma for Outstanding Airmanship. So, several other crews, they had put them in the simulator and tried to emulate this pattern, this procedure, this landing, and nobody made it out. Well, the aircraft was repaired at the airstrip, flew out 2 days later, and it had almost 25 years of service before it was finally scrapped January 1st, 2008. And they had some ideas of making it into kind of a memorial, stuff like that, because it was, historic aircraft. But they didn't get the correct bids they wanted, so the aircraft ended up being scrapped. But they took the metal fuselage skin and they made it into 10,000 sequentially numbered luggage tags that I guess you could buy. So anyway, that's the story of the Gimli glider, and quite a feat of airmanship after not the most sterling feat of mathematics on the part, of course, a number of people. But these things are these type of conversions are the type of thing you dread, because it doesn't take much of an error to get you into a lot of trouble. Anyway, that's the Gimli glider. I hope you found it interesting, informative, and could follow through with all the calculations as they were. Thanks for watching.